The little alien girl shivered in the dim glow of the human's cabin, her large eyes darting around for an escape. Her small, frail body was covered in soft, blue skin, and her thin fingers trembled as she hugged her knees. The human, a towering figure of muscle and warmth, sat a few feet away, calmly watching her. She had heard stories about humans, monstrous beings who devoured anything smaller than them. Her people whispered about ships that vanished in colonies that went silent. She was sure this was how it ended for her. Captured, helpless, food. The human, who called himself Jack, sighed and scratched his chin. You can't stop shaking now. I'm not gonna eat you. She didn't believe him. He had scooped her up from the wreckage of her crashed escape pod, brought her inside his strange metal home, and given her a blanket. It smelled odd, but it was warm. Still, kindness could be a trick. Jack stood up, moving slowly like he didn't want to scare her. He walked over to a small machine, pressed a few buttons, and a cup of something hot appeared in his hand. He set it down on the floor, then backed away. Drink, it's just tea. She hesitated, staring at the steam rising from the cup. Her people didn't drink this sort of thing. It smelled earthy, almost like home, but she refused to move. Jack sighed again and took a sip from his own cup. Suit yourself. Minutes passed in silence. The alien girl studied him, waiting for the moment his patience ran out and the hunger took over. But it just sat there, drinking his tea, occasionally glancing at a blinking device on the wall. Then, her stomach growled. Jack raised an eyebrow. Hungry. She stiffened. This was it. He had her weakness. He would use it against her. Instead, he stood up, rummaged through a box, and pulled out a packet of something. Tearing it open, he pulled out a small, round thing and took a bite. He chewed, swallowed, then held another one out to her. Cracker. She hesitated. Was this a test? A way to lure her closer? But the smell salty, plain, safe made her inch forward just a little. Her tiny fingers reached out, snatched the cracker, and she scurried back to her corner. Jack only chuckled. Tea, not so bad. She sniffed the cracker, licked it cautiously, then nibbled. The dry texture was strange, but it wasn't bad. Definitely not poisonous. Maybe humans didn't eat things alive after all. For days, she remained wary. She didn't speak much, and when she did, it was only a word or two. Jack didn't press her. He gave her food, let her sleep in a warm space, and never once tried to harm her. Slowly, she relaxed. She learned his name fully. Jack Carter, a mechanic who lived alone on this quiet space station. He worked on ships, fixing what others broke, and didn't seem bothered that she was an alien. He just called her Kid, since she never told him her real name. One evening, as he worked on a broken engine part, she finally asked, "Why help me?" Jack glanced at her, then shrugged. Seemed like the right thing to do. She frowned. Not food. He nearly choked on his drink. What? No, why would I eat you? She stared at him, confused. Humans eat small things. Jack laughed, shaking his head. Not like that. I mean, yeah, we eat animals, but not people. And you're a person, Kid. A person. No human had ever called her that before. From that moment on, she trusted him. She helped with small tasks, handing him tools and watching as he worked. She learned about human food, about music, and even about jokes though she didn't always understand them. Jack, in turn, learned about her people, about her lost ship, and why she had been so afraid. He listened, never dismissing her fears, but promising that not all humans were monsters. Weeks passed, and soon, her people came looking for her. A ship landed on the station, and Jack stood by her side as her people cautiously approached. They were stunned to find her alive, well-fed, and safe. As she prepared to leave, she turned to Jack, uncertain. "We'll see again." Jack smiled, ruffling her hair. "I hope so, Kid. Doors always open." For the first time, she smiled back. Maybe humans weren't so bad after all. When the human found her, she was shivering behind a pile of broken machinery, her tiny hands gripping a jagged piece of metal as if it could protect her. Her large, silver eyes stared at him, wide with terror. The dim glow of the cargo bay lights reflected off her smooth, pale blue skin. She was no taller than a child, though she was clearly not human. a fragile thing, trembling like a leaf caught in a storm. Elias had seen many strange things in his years of scavenging abandoned ships, but a tiny alien girl fearing for her life, that was new. He crouched down slowly, hands open to show he wasn't a threat. "Hey, easy there, I'm not gonna hurt you," he said, keeping his voice calm. She flinched but didn't move. Her breathing was rapid, her chest rising and falling in short gasps. He could see the panic in her eyes, the way she was trying to make herself as small as possible. "You understand me?" he asked, lowering himself to sit cross-legged a few feet away. He didn't want to scare her more than she already was. For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "Human, eat." Elias blinked. "What?" She hugged her knees, her small body trembling. "Humans eat us." A sharp laugh escaped him before he could stop it. "What? No. Who told you that?" Her silver eyes darted around as if expecting something to jump out at her. "Stories. We hear. Humans take us, cook us, devour us." Elias sighed, rubbing his face. "That's ridiculous." But looking at her, he could see she truly believed it. He sighed again, more gently this time. "Look, I don't know what stories you've heard, but I promise you, I'm not gonna eat you. I don't eat people." She studied him, suspicious but curious. "No, eat." "No, eat," he said firmly. Then, as if to prove his point, he reached into his bag and pulled out a protein bar. Unwrapping it slowly, he took a bite, chewed, and then held it out to her. "See, this is what I eat." She hesitated before reaching out, snatching it from his hand as if expecting him to attack. She sniffed it, then took the tiniest nibble. Her eyes widened slightly. "Good?" he asked. She nodded once. "Good," he said, leaning back against a crate. "Now, what's your name?" She hesitated again. "Leary." "Leary. All right, I'm Elias." He gave her a small smile. "What are you doing here, Leary?" She clutched the protein bar tightly, as if afraid it would disappear. Crash. Ship broken. Alone. Elias exhaled through his nose. That explained a lot. This ship had been adrift for weeks, a dead husk floating in the void. He had assumed there were no survivors, but somehow, this tiny alien girl had survived. "You got anyone else?" he asked. She shook her head. "All gone." Something tightened in Elias' chest. He had seen death before, but the thought of this little creature hiding alone, thinking she would be eaten if found, made something inside him ache. "All right," he said, standing. "Come on." Leary flinched again. "Where?" "Off this wreck. I've got a ship, food, water. You don't have to be alone anymore." She stared at him, uncertainty flickering across her face. "Nah, trick." He shook his head. "No trick, no eating, just help." For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she stood. She was so small that she barely reached his waist. Elias held out his hand. "Let's get out of here." "Yeah." Leary hesitated again, then slowly, carefully placed her tiny fingers in his. Together, they walked through the dark corridors of the ruined ship, leaving behind fear and loneliness. Elias led her towards something better. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Leary believed that maybe, just maybe, humans weren't the monsters she had been told they were. The tiny alien girl trembled, her large violet eyes darting around the darkened room. Her thin fingers clutched the rough edge of a metal crate, her small body barely visible in the shadows. The human had brought her here, and she didn't know why. She had heard stories terrible once. Her people spoke in whispers of the towering humans, their strange ways, their hunger. Some claimed they devoured creatures smaller than them without hesitation. She was small, too small. The human Saturday a few feet away, watching her with an unreadable expression. His broad frame filled the space, his face rough with stubble, his hands scarred from labor. He had given her food, a strange, steaming substance in a bowl. It smelled unfamiliar but not unpleasant. She hadn't touched it. Was it a trick? A test? Her stomach growled, betraying her. The human sighed. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he said, his voice deep but not unkind. "And I'm definitely not gonna eat you." She flinched at the words. How did he know what she feared? Did humans read minds? He rubbed a hand over his face. You don't understand me, do you? She understood some. The traders that had come to her world spoke bits of the human language, and she had listened, but fear made her cautious. The human stood, and she pressed herself further into the shadows, her small body stiff with panic. He didn't come closer. Instead, he walked to a cabinet, pulled out a container, and poured a thick, golden liquid into a cup. Then he dipped his finger in and licked it. Honey, he said. She blinked. He pushed the cup toward her, then stepped back. The sweet scent drifted toward her. It wasn't threatening. Slowly, hesitantly, she crept forward, her delicate fingers dipping into the golden substance. She brought it to her lips. Sweet. Her white eyes flicked up to meet his. He smiled, but not in the way of a predator. There was no sharpness, no danger, just warmth. See, he said, not so bad, right? She hesitated, then gave a tiny nod. Days passed. The human caught himself. David didn't hurt her. He didn't even try. He brought her food, clean water, and even a soft blanket that smelled of soap. He didn't keep her locked up. The door to the room was never sealed, but she didn't want. She had nowhere to go. She learned his words, slowly piecing them together. He was a pilot, stranded after a crash. He had found her on a damaged ship, the only survivor of her crew. He hadn't taken her. He had saved her. One night, as she sat near the small heater, wrapped in her blanket, she gathered the courage to speak. David, her voice was soft, uncertain. His head lifted in surprise. Yeah. She hesitated, then asked, You, no eat? He let out a short laugh, shaking his head. No, kid, I don't eat people, or aliens. A long pause, then, in a voice so quiet, it was nearly lost in the hum of the heater, she whispered, My name is Luma. His expression softened. That's a nice name, Luma. Something in her chest loosened. For the first time in days, she felt safe. The days stretched into weeks. She learned more words, more about him, more about the world being her own. She learned that humans weren't monsters, or at least, this one wasn't. David worked on repairing his ship, and Luma helped however she could, her tiny hands fitting into spaces his couldn't. They became a team, and when the ship was ready, he looked at her with a question in his eyes. Do you want to come with me? Luma thought about the stories she had been told, fear, the warnings. Then she thought about the warmth of the heater, the sweetness of honey, the safety of a name spoken kindly. She reached out, taking his hand in hers. Yes. David smiled, and together they stepped into the stars. The tiny alien girl trembled as she huddled in the corner of the cargo hold, her large, golden eyes fixed on the towering human before her. She was no bigger than a human toddler, with pale blue skin and delicate, translucent wings that fluttered weakly from fear. Her people had spoken of human monstrous creatures who roamed the stars, devouring anything smaller than them, and now she was trapped with one, the human, a tall man with rough hands and a tired face, crouched down slowly. His voice was calm, but she didn't understand the words. His dark eyes studied her, and she expected him to lunge at any moment. Her tiny hands clutched the metal floor beneath her, ready to run if she had to. But he didn't move. He reached into a pouch at his waist and pulled something out. She flinched, expecting a weapon, but instead, he held a small, silver packet. He tore it open and held it out to her. The scent of food filled the air. Her stomach twisted painfully. She hadn't eaten in days. Still, she didn't move. What if this was a trick? What if he wanted to fatten her up before eating her? The human sighed and, to her shock, took a bite of the food himself. He chewed, swallowed, then placed the packet on the floor and slid it toward her. He backed away, giving her space. She watched him carefully, waiting for the moment he would strike. Minutes passed. He didn't move. Hunger won over fear. Hesitantly, she inched forward, her tiny fingers reaching for the food. It was soft, slightly sweet. She took a cautious bite, then another. When she looked up, the human was still sitting there, watching, but his expression wasn't cruel. The ship rumbled as it drifted through space. She had been hiding here since her escape pod had been drawn in by its gravity field. The human had found her while checking his cargo. Now, she was his prisoner, or at least, she thought she was. The next day, he returned. He didn't force her to leave her corner but placed more food and water nearby. He spoke softly, though she didn't understand him. He even left a small, folded cloth for her to sleep on. Days passed, and the human's patience never wavered. He never tried to grab her or force her into a cage. Instead, he brought her gifts, pieces of dried fruit, a soft scarf, even a small, glowing stone that warmed her hands when she held it. Slowly, she began to trust him. She tried to speak to him, though her language was strange to his ears. He responded, his voice deep but kind. They didn't understand each other, but it didn't seem to matter. One evening, as she curled up on the cloth he had given her, she felt something, unexpected safety. Then, everything changed. The ship's alarm blared, red lights flashing across the walls. She woke with a start as the human rushed in, his face tense. He spoke quickly, pointing toward the door. She didn't understand, but she knew one faint danger. A loud crash shook the ship, and suddenly, the air felt wrong. She gasped as she realized what was happening. Decompression. Something had hit the ship. The human grabbed a mask and placed it over his face before running toward her. For the first time, he reached out. She shrank back on instinct, but his eyes weren't filled with hunger. They were filled with something else, a desperation. He held out a small oxygen mask for her. She hesitated only a second before taking it. He helped her adjust it, his fingers careful and steady. Then, he lifted her into his arms and ran through the shaking corridors, past flickering lights. He carried her as if she weighed nothing. She clung to his jacket, her tiny heart racing. Finally, they reached an escape pod. He placed her inside and fastened the safety straps around her. He pressed buttons on a screen, setting coordinates. She looked at him in confusion. He wasn't strapping himself in. He wasn't coming. Panic filled her. She grabbed his sleeve, shaking her head. He only smiled, his tired face soft. He spoke again, but this time, she understood without knowing the words. He was staying behind. Tears burned her golden eyes as the pod doors sealed. A moment later, she was launched into space, the force pressing her back into the seat. Through the small window, she saw his ship damaged, smoke trailing from its hull. It grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared. The pod systems guided her toward a distant planet, and she curled into the seat, clutching the scarf he had given her. She had feared the human would devour her, but in the end, he had saved her life. When Sergeant Ben Carter first saw the tiny alien girl, she was huddled in the corner of a wrecked escape pod. Her wide, black eyes filled with terror. Her skin was a soft shade of violet, and her small hands trembled as she clutched a piece of broken metal like a weapon. She was barely the size of a human child, her thin limbs wrapped in torn fabric that must have once been a uniform. She flinched as he stepped closer, her large eyes darting to the rifle slung over his shoulder. Ben sighed, raising his hands in what he hoped was a universal sign of peace. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he said softly. "You need help." The alien girl made a strange, warbling sound in response, pressing herself further into the wall of the pod. Her species, whatever they were, wasn't one he recognized, but she was young, alone, and clearly afraid. Then she spoke, her voice shaking. You eat me." Ben blinked. "What? No." She stared at him, unblinking, her small chest rising and falling quickly. "Humans, small creatures," she whispered. Ben ran a hand down his face. "Okay, that is a no. Not me. Not humans. At least not like that." He crouched down, keeping his movements slow. "Look, you're scared. I get it, but I'm here to help." She didn't look convinced, but she also didn't have much of a choice. Her pod was dead, her ship nowhere in sight, and she was stranded on a war-ravaged planet with no supplies. Ben reached into his pack and pulled out a ration bar, peeling the wrapper back and taking a bite to show it was safe. Then he extended it toward her. "Food, not you. Tea." She hesitated before slowly reaching out and taking it. Sniffing it carefully, she nibbled at the edge. Her eyes widened, and she quickly devoured the rest. Ben chuckled. "Guess you are hungry." The girl nodded cautiously. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated before murmuring, "Larry." "Nice to meet you, Larry. I'm Ben." He stood up and offered a hand. "Let's get out of here." "Okay." She hesitated again, then, with clear reluctance, placed her small hand in his. Over the next few days, Leary remained wary, but her fear slowly faded. Ben found a temporary shelter in an abandoned bunker, where they could rest and avoid ongoing conflict between humans and the alien forces that had attacked the colony. She watched him closely, flinching at loud noises and eyeing his movements like she expected him to turn on her at any moment, but he never did. He shared his food, gave her blankets, and even let her tinker with a damaged drone he had salvaged. To his surprise, she was incredibly skilled, her small fingers moving with practiced ease as she rewired circuits and fixed components he had given up on. One evening, as they sat near a dimly lit lantern, she finally spoke more than a few words. "You are not like stories," she murmured, her voice soft. Ben looked up from the rifle he was cleaning. "Stories?" She nodded, hiking her knees. "My people say humans destroy. At they take and take. At they eat." She hesitated, clearly embarrassed. Ben exhaled. "Not all of us are good. Not all of us are bad. Same with your kind, I bet." She looked down, thoughtful. "Maybe." Silence stretched between them before she spoke again. "You saved me." Ben shrugged. "Seemed like the right thing to do." Her eyes studied him, something shifting in her expression. For the first time, she didn't look afraid. Days turned into weeks. The war around them raged on, but in their small corner of the world, a strange sort of trust formed. Leary stopped flinching when he moved. She started talking more, asking questions about Earth, about humans, about why he had joined the military. Then, one night, their fragile peace was shattered. The enemy found them. Ben woke to the sound of heavy boots and the sharp whine of energy weapons charging outside the bunker. Leary was already awake, eyes wide with panic. "Stay behind me," he whispered, grabbing his rifle. She didn't listen. Instead, she grabbed the repaired drone, now operational thanks to her efforts, and pressed a few buttons. The machine worked to life, its small frame darting out through a side vent. Moments later, the sound of confused shouts and sudden gunfire erupted outside. Leary grabbed Ben's hand. "Run!" They sprinted through a side passage as explosions rocked the bunker. The enemy was too distracted by the rogue drone to notice them slipping away. When they finally reached the edge of the ruins, panting and exhausted, Ben turned to Leary in disbelief. "You hacked the drone." She nodded. "You saved me. Now I save you." And let out a breathless laugh. "I guess that makes us even." She gave him a small, proud smile. "Maybe." Eventually, they found an evacuation point where Ben's squad had set up a temporary base. At first, the other soldiers were wary of Leary, just as she was of them. But as days passed, she proved herself with her quick mind and sharp skills, helping repair damaged tech and even assisting with tactical planning. When the final evacuation orders came, Ben had a choice: leave her behind or take her with him. It wasn't a hard choice at all. Leary stood beside him as they boarded the transport ship, her small hand gripping his sleeve. "You ready for a new adventure?" he asked. She gave a small, determined nod. "Yes." And together, they left the war behind, stepping into a future neither of them had expected. The little alien girl trembled in the corner of the dimly lit cargo bay, her large black eyes filled with fear. Her small, delicate hands clutched the torn fabric of her tunic as she stared at the towering figure before her. A human, a real human. She had heard stories about them, terrible stories. Humans were giants who crushed entire worlds beneath their feet. They were monsters who ate the flesh of other beings without a second thought. And now, one of them stood only a few feet away, his sharp eyes studying her like a predator sizing up its prey. Eli Carter, a cargo hauler making a routine stop on a desolate moon, had not expected to find a tiny alien child hidden inside a crate of spare engine parts. She was small, barely reaching his knee, with pale blue skin and thin, spindly limbs. He could see the fear in her eyes, her body shaking as she shrank against the cold metal wall. He sighed, crouching down slowly to appear less threatening. "Hey, kid," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The girl didn't move. She barely seemed to breathe. Her species was unknown to him, but he knew fear when he saw it, and this child was terrified out of her mind. Eli pulled a protein bar from his pocket and placed it on the floor between them. You hungry? The girl's eyes flickered toward the food, then back to his face. She didn't trust him. Eli didn't blame her. Whatever she had been through before ending up in his cargo hold, it clearly hadn't been good. He sat her down cross-legged, giving her space. You got a name? She hesitated before whispering something barely audible. Miri. Nice to meet you, Miri. I'm Eli. She still didn't move. Eli exhaled through his nose, rubbing a hand over his short beard. Look, I don't know how you got here, but I'm guessing it wasn't on purpose. If you want, I can take you somewhere safe. Miri's thin fingers curled tighter around her tunic. You will not eat me. Eli blinked. Then, to his surprise, he laughed. What? No, why would I eat you? She hesitated before whispering. Humans eat other beings. Eli shook his head. Not me, kid, I promise. Slowly, Miri's shoulders relaxed, though she still eyed him with caution. After a long moment, she reached for the protein bar. Her fingers were delicate, barely strong enough to tear the wrapper, so Eli helped her open it. She sniffed it suspiciously before taking a small bite. Eli watched as she chewed, her eyes widening slightly. She took another bite, then another, devouring the bar like she hadn't eaten in days. Easy there, he said. I got more. You don't have to rush. Miri slowed down, chewing thoughtfully. Eli leaned back, resting his arms on his knees. So, where's your family? Miri's face darkened. She lowered the half-eaten bar to her lap. Gone. Eli felt a pain in his chest. He had seen enough suffering to recognize loss when he heard it. He didn't press her for details. Instead, he nodded. I'm sorry. They sat in silence for a while, the hum of the ship filling the empty space between them. After a few minutes, Miri shifted slightly, her fear not completely gone, but no longer paralyzing her. Where will you take me? Eli thought for a moment. He had contacts on a nearby station, people who could help get Miri to a safe colony, where she could have a future. Someplace good, he said. Someplace where you'll be safe. Miri studied him, her dark eyes searching his face for any sign of deception. When she found none, she gave the smallest of nods. Eli stood up and stretched. Come on, let's find you a proper meal. Miri hesitated, but then pushed herself up onto shaky legs. She was still wary, but something in her posture had changed. She no longer looked at him like a monster. As Eli led her toward the galley, he glanced down and saw her tiny fingers curl into the fabric of his sleeve. Not grabbing, not pulling, just resting there, as if seeking reassurance. He let her. Maybe fate had thrown them together in the cold darkness of space for a reason. Maybe, just maybe, they both needed each other more than they realized. The alien girl huddled in the corner of the metallic room, her small, trembling body wrapped in a thin, ragged cloak. Her deep violet eyes were wide with fear as she stared at the towering human before her. His heavy boots clinked against the floor as he took a cautious step forward, his expression unreadable. She had always been told that humans were monsters. Stories of their cruelty had spread across her colony, how they crushed weaker species, devoured anything that wasn't their own, and conquered planets without mercy. And now, she was trapped with one. Her people had been fleeing when their escape ship was shut down. She had been separated from the others, running through the wreckage until she was captured by the human. He had not harmed her yet, but she was certain it was only a matter of time. The human sighed and crouched to her level. His face was different from what she had imagined. His eyes weren't filled with hunger or malice, but something else, something almost soft. She flinched as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, wrapped object. Carefully, he unwrapped it and held it out to her. It was food, a simple, rectangular bar, brown and slightly rough, but the scent made her stomach ache with hunger. She hadn't eaten in days. Still, she eyed him warily. What if it was a trick? Go on, the human said. His voice was deep but not harsh. It's safe. Her fingers, thin and covered in tiny scales, trembled as she took the food. She sniffed it, then took a tiny bite. The taste was plain, but it filled the emptiness in her stomach. She chewed slowly, still watching him. See, he said with a small smile, I'm not going to hurt you. She swallowed and hesitated before whispering in a shaky voice, "Humans eat everything." He let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Not everything, and definitely not you." She didn't know if she could believe him, but he hadn't hurt her. He had given her food, and he hadn't locked her up, just brought her here, into this strange, quiet room filled with unfamiliar human things. She glanced at the metal door. It wasn't locked. If she wanted to, she could run, but where would she go? Her people were gone. The humans had taken over the area. If she ran, she would only end up in the hands of someone worse. The human watched her, his expression thoughtful. "You're alone, aren't you?" She looked down, gripping the food tightly. She didn't want to admit it, but the truth weighed heavily on her small frame. His voice softened. "I lost people too." Her eyes flicked up to meet his. There was something in his Gazean understanding, a kind of pain she recognized. She knew what it felt like to lose a home, to be left behind. For a long time, they sat her day in silence. She ate the rest of the food slowly, and it didn't rush her. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and looked at him again. "What will happen to me?" she asked quietly. He sighed. "I don't know yet, but I won't let anyone hurt you." She studied his face, searching for any sign of a lie. She found none. The fear inside her did not disappear completely, but it faded just a little. Maybe humans were monsters. Maybe they destroyed things they didn't understand. But maybe, just maybe, some of them were different. She pulled her cloak tighter around herself and whispered, "Okay." He smiled again, standing up. "Come on, let's get you somewhere safe." For the first time since the crash, she felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe fate had other plans after all.